Hi, I'm Geoffrey McCullough, and welcome to another episode of Design Doc. This episode is going to be a little bit different, because in the previous episodes, I've picked one or a couple of games in order to show off a specific point I wanted to make about game design. This episode is going to end up being a bit more loose, because I wanted to talk directly to those viewers who are burgeoning game designers, or maybe currently working on a solo project right now. Let's say you're currently working on the design document for your game, or you're in the middle of coding it. The ultimate goal of any game is that they should be fun. And achieving that fun is done in a wide amount of ways, and using randomness as a little spice in order to, liven up gameplay is a great way to keep replayability up, allowing players to love your game time after time after time. The big question though is, when is randomness a good idea to implement in your game? Well, as you know by now, this is Design Doc, a series where we look at seemingly simple game mechanics. In this episode, when to be random. Now, the usage of randomness can drastically change the very core of your game. Take chess for example, the classic board game. There's no randomness in it at all. All the pieces move the exact same ways, depending on if you're black or white. There's no variance between what pawns can do. They can always do the same moves. There's no randomness whatsoever. Because of this, it's up to the players themselves and the choices they make that determine the outcome of the game and how a game plays, one time or another time. And because of this, it's up to the players to decide how the game shapes out. It's not because of a random occurrence that pawns move the way they do or players take the choices they do for their defenses. It's not like you start with random pieces like a random number of rooks, knights, or bishops. You always have the same pieces at your disposal at the beginning of the game. Now, completely contrast that with something on the complete other end of the spectrum, like poker. Players have no control over what cards turn up in a game of poker. What they can control, however, is if they bet or fold. Therefore, the main game of poker is all about whether or not you continue to play your hand, or by tricking other players into thinking that your hand is good. While players cannot directly influence what cards appear, they can influence the decisions other players make by whether or not they're good at lying or not. Now, that makes poker interesting compared to chess because the layers of gameplay are based around the meta of the game, rather than the meta of the pieces themselves and the choices player directly influence on the game itself. To move the examples closer to video games, on the less extreme side you have, say, fighting games. All of your attacks will always have the same frame data, damage, whether or not they're good in certain situations or not. Your punches and kicks will always have the same frame data, do the same amount of damage, have the same number of recovery frames. Both players know what they have at their disposal and can use those tools in order to pressure their opponent and make them do something and open them up for damage and then eventually win. Meanwhile, on the complete other end of the spectrum from fighting games, you have the roguelike genre, which is all about gathering items and setting up your character's build in a way that is shaped by what items you find in the world. Players usually have no influence over what items they pick up, so they have to adjust their gameplay style based on what they find. Now, all of these examples lie on the two extremes of what I'm talking about today. If you had a fighting game where your moves did very inconsistent damage and you couldn't really predict how a certain move would play out, or if you had a chess game where you started with a random amount of pieces and you had to adopt your strategy based on what pieces you had at your disposal, it's very hard to say that skill was the thing that guaranteed a player a win. On the one hand, you could say that a player's ability, that they were able to adapt and overcome what they were dealt with by the randomness, is a show of their skill. Heck, isn't that the whole point of roguelikes? Whereas if you won a match in a fighting game because your punch happened to do 2 more damage than their punch, then it's hard to say that your personal skill was the reason you won. Now, talking about randomized damage has made me want to boot up one of my favorite classic games of all time, Heroes 3. Now, Heroes of Might and Magic 3 is a turn-based strategy game where once you get into battles, the combat is sort of like a tactic-style game. So you have a turn order and you're moving creatures on the battlefield in order to engage the enemies. Now, I was saying earlier it'd be kind of silly if a fighting game was won because your punch happened to do more damage. Well, that's kind of what this game is doing. Each creature has their own damage stat, which is further influenced by their attack stat, and that determines how much damage they poke their enemies with. Now, some creatures have very consistent damage, whether that be 2 to 3 damage per creature in the stack. Other enemies can be wildly inconsistent with their damage. Now, what number you roll based on your damage is amplified by each creature in the stack. Since when you attack, you roll a random number based on your damage range. And then, that number is multiplied by each creature in your current creature stack. So if you have a group of 100 creatures that can deal anywhere between 1 and 3 damage, if you roll a 1, you're dealing 100 damage. If you roll a 3, you're dealing 300 damage, which in Heroes 3 is a big difference. So I just spoke in ill terms about this exact situation. How can you say this is skill winning you the game when it's just a random chance that you'll deal 200 extra damage? Well, a big part of Heroes 3 gameplay is preparation. On the overworld map, when you're searching for fights, there are artifacts all over the place that can help influence how matches turn out in your favor. One of these items is your hero's spellbook, which fills with spells as you build the mage guild in your main towns. And one of the spells you can learn there is a spell called Bless. Now what Bless does is once you cast it on your creature, they will always deal the maximum amount of damage they can possibly have. So for instance, if I had that 100 creature stack that can deal 1 to 3 damage each creature, if they are blessed, they will always deal that 3 damage, thus I'm getting that 300 damage. However, casting Bless eats into your spell point total. So the choices there that the player can make is that they're doing their best in order to try and rig the matches as much in their favor as possible. Whether that be bringing better creatures into the fight or coming very prepared with spells that can help combat the random nature of the damage. As well, damage spells such as Magic Arrow and Ice Bolt will always do the same amount of damage every time. The tools are in the player's hands to determine how much the randomness affects their gameplay. If you're gonna take one lesson away from this video, it's that you should always have a reason why you're putting randomness into your game. If your game is in a point where you can freely test out and tweak ideas on the fly, ask yourself what happens if you use a flat number instead of a random number. How much does that change the game? Using the Heroes 3 example from earlier, how much damage you do can be the result of killing 1 creature in a stack or 2 creatures in a stack, and that difference can be major, especially in the creatures that do massive damage, where killing even one of them can massively lower their damage output. Another question you can ask is, can you pull a number from somewhere else? Does it have to be random, or can we pull a number from, say, a player stat? Using a number that the player can interact with, such as a stat that a player can upgrade over time through doing events like leveling up or defeating people or whatever, that adds more decisions in the player's laps how they want to proceed with the game that they're playing. And that is the one thing at the end of the day that you need to be very cautious about when using random numbers. And that is taking control away from players. Now, there's obviously things you want to take away control of the players, such as what your computer AI does against them, but the more ways you give your players to interact with your game, the more investment they're going to have in it, and as such can add additional layers of gameplay. Randomness, if used correctly and with purpose, can be great for a game, but it's very easy to mess up its implementation. Do you have any personal habits you have when it comes to working with random numbers in either game design or anywhere else? I'd love to hear about what you think in the comments. As for now, I'm Geoffrey McCullough, and thank you so much for watching this quick episode of Design Doc.